This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, we are live. Lecture capture is on. So hello to anybody who's not here today but listening later. Hope to see you soon. And welcome to you all. It's great to see quite a large number of people enrolled in this subject. I'm not sure why. Somebody told me in administration that word went out that it was like maybe it's a bit of an easy subject, so kind of the word went out and people joined up that. It isn't, sorry, so you can leave now if you think it is. I'm hoping kind of more, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I'm hoping the reason why we have over 100 students enrolled in this elective is because housing's kind of important these days, and it's not abstract anymore. I think everybody's kind of living what is, in fact, a kind of housing crisis in this country. Even if you're not directly affected, somebody you know is seriously affected, and it's not just in Melbourne, it's all over the world. So I'm guessing that might be part of the reason you're here, not just because you think it's just a couple of essays, no problem. Hi, I'm Mike Collins. I'm the coordinator. I'll talk a little bit about myself in a moment, and I'll introduce you to your tutors, our team for this year. First of all, let me talk about what we're going to do today. It's going to be reasonably light on today, as week ones tend to be, but I do want to kind of provoke some kind of thoughts and kind of ideas in you, kind of very much drawn from the readings I've kind of given you to kind of look at this week. But if today seems a bit light on, it's not going to be light on from kind of week 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for sure, because there's actually a lot of tough stuff to kind of get through and conceptually get through as we kind of really get a handle around the kind of housing systems and how they work and all the various kind of ideas about what's right and what's wrong with them, etc. But this week's going to be a little more of a taster. We're going to just do some introductions, tell you where the tutes are, if you don't know. I'm going to talk about the course, the content, the assignments, just a little bit. I mean, you've got the subject guide, it's all in the subject guide, but I'll just kind of talk you through it to give you a kind of sense of flavour of it. And at that part of the proceedings today, you know, if you've got questions, things don't make sense, if you're worried that something's missing, that I've left a really important part of this subject kind of out of the subject content, and I might have, because housing's got so many things in it, put your hand up, ask a question, ask for clarification. With the assignments as well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with the assignments. That's for you and the tutors to kind of work through. Your tutor's main job, I think, apart from the broad kind of, you know, facilitating your education, is, you know, in this subject, is actually to get you the best mark you can get and to help you do that. So, you know, that's, I won't be talking a lot about the assignments. I've designed them to be interesting but also challenging. and then I'll show you a few pictures and talk a bit, and then we'll be done. Let's see, we might even get out of here early today. I'm not sure. I do tend to talk too long sometimes, but I'm trying to kind of keep that in check. But let's get into the first part, introductions, meet the team. This is a terrible picture of me and my chins. A little bit about myself. I have, as Australians say, a bit of an accent. It's because I'm an immigrant. I come from Ireland originally. I was actually born in the UK. It's complicated. I've complicated identity issues. I'll try not to voice that on you too much. But I've been in Australia about 23 of the last 30 years. Melbourne's my home, so I'm an accidental social planner. I'm an accidental lecturer, to be quite honest. I've had a few different careers. I'm not an academic. I work in local government. I teach here. I get involved in kind of issues I really care about. I'm driven by really passion for social change. That's me. If you want to kind of understand what kind of gets me up in the morning, it's the fact that, Jesus, a lot of things kind of need dealing with, and we should all do our bit. So that's my kind of philosophy of life. I've been teaching subjects here for about 5 years, mostly social planning subjects like inclusive cities, which I can't do this year, even though it's the second best subject this year. Some of you might be doing it, but I can't do it this year because I'm doing this. But I'm very much kind of come from that, I guess, a focus on kind of really integrating different knowledges into every piece of work, and in terms of that, the approach I kind of take in terms of and you'll see that, and it's a reason why the first assignment is a housing narrative, is I come from, in terms of as an educator, from a social constructivist perspective, in terms of I see myself as a facilitator, working with you with the knowledge that you bring to actually to build a kind of a community of knowledge that can happen to actually grow that knowledge. I don't have a bar of the kind of the container theory of education, where you come here every week and I pour in housing knowledge to you. You've got a huge amount of knowledge yourselves, and so I'm working on the basis that you know a lot already, rather than you know nothing. I hope I don't get too far ahead of you then, but I'm trusting that you're actually all pretty smart people with a pretty good experience in the world already. Maybe I'll invite the rest of you up. Will I invite you one at a time, or whatever? No. Okay, meet your tutors. I'll invite them up. And I might, as they come up, as I put their slides up, I might invite each of you just to kind of say a few words. Do you want to come around? Because we're working off these mics.
I realize my picture doesn't similar to what I am now. A bit much younger. You want to introduce me, or I continue?
Introduce yourself, Marjan.
Hello, everybody. I'm Marjan Hajjari, and I'm the tutor for 2 of the sessions, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity. Welcome to these subjects. Very interesting, especially the way that Mike has put together the very interesting readings. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. About myself, I have been in this university for about 4 years. I did my PhD here in urban design, and at the same time I was doing a PhD, I was tutoring in a lot of subjects: urban environment, shaping urban design studies, strategic planning study, and all of that. After I finished my PhD, I did just one time tutorial, but then after that I started a full-time job that didn't let me to do it again. So this is a complete first time after finishing my PhD and have done work in local and state government, I started tutoring. So I'm so excited because I have to admit, PhD is interesting but so stressful. So I feel that when I was working in the university, I was like, oh my God, I'm happy that I'm coming and I'm coming to teach, not to study. So I think that is a very good opportunity for me. I have a Master of Architecture and Master of Urban Design that I both did back in Iran. And similar to Mike, I'm migrant, but I came to Australia 10 years ago as a skilled migrant. During my PhD and after that, I work in local government. I work both as urban designer and social planner. At the moment, I'm the senior urban designer in Department of Jobs, Precinct and Region. Before that, I was working in Fishermen's Bend Task Force, if any of you have heard about that. It's the largest urban renewal area in Australia. So interesting and very challenging project. So my encounter with the issue of housing started mainly from that project and is still continuing as the person working in state government. But I'm here in my capacity as the academic and with lots of experience. I'm sure I'm not presenting government, but I'm happy to discuss with you my experience and my personal view about government. Thank you.
Thanks, Marja.
Applause, that's good. Thanks, Mike. And after Margin, I'm Alex Antoniadis, so I am a strategic planner by virtue of my title. I've worked as a statutory planner as well, and also did the Masters of Urban Planning at this university, so I've sat in that seat and I've done this subject, so hopefully that can provide some good assistance to everyone. Also tutored statutory planning and law last semester as well. So so I've got quite a breadth of experience in terms of working as a planner, both from the statutory and strategic side, and I hope to bring quite a wide-ranging view of housing typologies and how that impacts everyone, from students to academics to everyone really in the room. So I want to get from this subject how housing impacts you as students, as also as regular people as well. And I think Mike's really tailored the program to ensure that we can capture all those different facets of housing and planning as well. So I hope to bring those skill sets to the subject and work collaboratively with the students. And I'm taking 3 of the tutes this semester. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. And finally...
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Lombardi. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst in Housing in the Victorian Government. You mentioned housing narrative, so I might start with mine. I grew up in Glen Waverley, and when I was younger, it started as a very middle-class, quiet suburb, and it's now, I watched it change and evolve into a suburb, very high density. The school, the local school went from strength to strength as well, so I kind of experienced a real change in the suburb that I grew up in. That made me interested in housing, and I studied the Bachelor of Property and Construction here at Melbourne Uni in 2005, way back before the Melbourne model, and a Bachelor of Commerce. I then went and did a Master of Public Policy and Management, and I was doing this part-time while I was working in government, in housing and in property advisory. And my master's research was on the way that we essentially with suburbs, either frame low socioeconomic suburbs as either around opportunities for growth, so gentrification, they're the next hotspot, or we frame them around the idea that they're dangerous and should be avoided. So it's a very binary narrative. More recently, I've been working in social housing reform in the Victorian government. So that's managing the 60,000 public housing dwellings that the Victorian government owns and manages, as well as the regulatory aspect for the 20,000 community housing dwellings. These are owned by non-for-profits such as Salvation Army. I've been in that space for about a year now. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, I'll let you sit down now. It's all right. Put you on the spot. So, I'm not just saying this because they're here today, but I'm actually really flattered that they actually want to work with the subject and work with me, because there's a really great depth of kind of skill and experience kind of in the team here, and I hope that you find with the tutorials that you are taking every opportunity basically to, you know, learn from them, and also challenge them as well. Please do. This is about part of, I think, for everybody here, because we're all practitioners. We all work in different parts of government, and when you work in government, some of you might know about this. If you've worked in government, you've got to kind of be careful, kind of how you kind of present your kind of views and all that. You're working in a system which is very much kind of controls kind of messages and ideas, and often it's got a very strong kind of ideology of what it is. And we, as I think, in talking to all of you, we kind of welcome the opportunity to come into the academy and actually have that freedom to kind of to be challenged and to challenge kind of our ideas about kind of what we might do in our day jobs, and whether that's actually the best kind of approach, whether the underlying assumptions that we have about what we do, whether it's about how we might, Paul's working on kind of policy about kind of the actual structure of how you might, provision social housing. I'm doing things like I've, been involved in setting up an independent company as part of the local government to build housing. I don't know if that's going to work. It's a mad experiment, and there's all these things that kind of we do, but we learn. We all learn from coming into this space, and learn from you as well. So that really is an invitation to kind of, especially in the tutorial space, to really kind of, bring your thoughts and your ideas and your experience kind of to that. So the tutorial schedule. At this point, we have 6 tutorials for this subject. I'm really hoping that's the end of it, because the numbers have kept rising, but I'm thinking 6 will be the hopefully the maximum tutorials we'll have, but at the moment we've got only about leeway for about 4 or 5 places, so I can't be sure about that. That means they're all either full or very nearly full, and that's very important. I want to kind of emphasize that if you're registered in a tutorial, that's the tutorial you go to, please. We really don't have a lot of scope unless the system accepts your change of tutorial, meaning you find a 6:15 tutorial that's got 1 spot available, which you might today, but certainly the 5:15 and 7:15 tutorials are completely full, and I would ask you please to kind of not cause us administrative headaches by kind of turning up at other tutorials and then arguing and say, couldn't I do this, couldn't I do that, or I need to do this, do that. It's actually not really fair on kind of everybody in the system there. But if there are kind of circumstances where you really need to change it and they're extenuating circumstances, then email me on that. But not, I would prefer, or I've seen one of the tutors and I like them better than the one I've got and I want to change. No, I'm not having it, okay? So please, you should know which tutorial you're kind of in, as everybody kind of looks at that and kind of go, I know which one is mine from your registration. I just want to check. There's been one, that room has changed in the last few days. It used to be 121 in MSD, and that tutorial, the one that Paul's running, just got changed and put online a few days ago. So just to be aware of, that to make sure that what you're registered is the one you turn up with tomorrow. Because obviously the rooms aren't all together. The rooms are all over the place. Some of them are even in the Redmond Barry building as well. All right. Any questions about tutorials? Any concerns? Are we all good? Good. Maybe we won't have any admin nightmares in week 1. It's never happened before, but, be hopeful. All right, a few things I just wanted to kind of mention. You may be aware of all of these things I kind of go through, but I just like to kind of emphasize them because I've seen in my experience both as an academic in here on campus, and also sort of through people I know who've been students and gone through various kind of things and got various help, I've kind of come to kind of respect some of the additional services that are available. They're not all perfect, and some of them could be better, but there's a few things that I really want to emphasise with you. First of all, the library. They actually, you know, you may have to make appointments. They are very busy, but they actually have put up very good resources online that will kind of help you kind of through any kind of areas which you feel less confident in, feel you have gaps in or whatever. And there's also, you know, they're also kind of accessible, kind of, I mean, you might need to track them down if you want help, especially things like, you know, things like references. If you're kind of new to the housing space, or you might be relatively new to kind of doing work, writing kind of in this kind of planning kind of social policy space, because I know a bunch of you are property students, etc. Do kind of look to kind of the help that you can get in terms of getting you know, those resources that you need for your assignments, especially, as well as, you know, if you feel, you know, a little less fully kind of confident with your English expression, please kind of, you know, seek out the resources that are there and advocate for yourself for them. I know they're in high demand, but, you know, you just gotta, as the Australian phrase goes, you know, you gotta back yourself in this, and these things are very important. A few other things also mentioned in terms of what's available, as well as the libraries, as academic skills. There's a lot of online stuff now. They used to have people available that could meet you. I think they've kind of backed away from that a little bit, unfortunately, but there is a lot of resources available, and kind of courses and things like that, seminars worth looking at. If you have if you do live with a disability, and that might be of any kind, and I'm not assuming that any of you do or don't, because a great many disabilities aren't obviously kind of visible, kind of in day-to-day interaction. But you have rights. You have significant rights, and you have. So if you feel you need accommodations to ensure that you get the best learning outcome that you deserve, then do kind of track down disability services and see whether you have grounds to register and get any additional kind of assistance or accommodation there. Again, I encourage you to be assertive, because you absolutely have that right. You know, and the university here knows it. But what I've found in terms of people using disability resources is that often they can be underused in terms of actually getting assistance, because maybe people feel not confident to kind of ask. It's totally confidential. If it doesn't work out, nobody knows about it. But if there are some, you know, things that you're you know, that you live with as a disability, then please kind of seek out assistance. Similarly, the counselling psychological services, I know they book up very quickly. You know, being a student is very stressful. Sometimes often being on the other side of the world from kind of where your supports are is very stressful. So they're not always kind of hard to get kind of available on demand, but they do have drop-in times, and they do have some good people in there that can kind of provide you with support. The other thing I want to mention, and you won't find it on any of the university website stuff, because they seem to kind of deny the existence of the student union, but the student union does exist. The student union does offer actually some really, really good services and resources. If you're not aware of that, kind of just, you know, go across the way, kind of suss it out. In particular, what I've become aware of is if you have any kind of issues coming up with the university, things that you think you're not being treated fairly or anything like that, the student union does actually offer advocacy It can offer people to kind of be there on your behalf to support you as well in things like that. So I encourage you to kind of look at, everybody pays in to the student union, and there are actually, beyond obviously the societies and the other kind of services, the more kind of obvious kind of services they offer, they do actually offer you assistance, in terms of as a student as well. So, it still seems that in nearly every subject, people get into very serious trouble for either collusion or plagiarism. I find that remarkable because, you should be aware of the kind of systems that are in place that kind of pick it up, and the fact that, the implications can be really serious. So can I kind of really emphasize with you to, really think about your practice, and doing something by accident doesn't get you off the hook. If you're in a hurry, if you're doing kind of the all day Sunday kind of up to 11:59 kind of write-up, and you're just going, and you forget that something's a direct quote from your notes, and it kind of goes in, that's not actually an excuse. You need to be kind of organized with stuff like that. Also, just be aware as well that I'm sure you are, but I'll just to kind of show you kind of what we see as well when kind of papers come in through Turnitin. There's the report kind of flags issues that may be of concern. Half the time, a lot of them aren't. It's just like Turnitin isn't kind of that smart, so it'll pick up really dumb stuff and put your percentage up. That's okay. Don't worry about that. We're all, we all know what's plagiarism and what's the fact that it's just reading titles and reading references and stuff like that. That's fine. So the percentage isn't a thing, but the rule of thumb is that anything over 15%, you have a good look at it. Right? If it's over 15% comes up, we have a good look at it. That's the kind of rule we kind of use. Just so you know. I presume other lecturers have told you this, tutors? I don't know. I'm a very kind of I'll tell you everything I know, so you know where you stand. There's no secret squirrel stuff about this. And this is what it looks like it turning into us. So just so you're aware, so basically anything that's ever been put anywhere online, any part of the world, including so pretty much any university, including this one, including, the one your mate kind of put in, the paper your mate put in last week. It's all in here. And so everything, so that whole kind of discipline about paraphrasing, about actually demonstrating that you actually understand something and kind of can condense knowledge, etc. is really important. So, also, the other thing to kind of look out for. Hi, you have your hand up. Hi.
Just a quick question about turning in.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's an urban myth, but people turning in assignments from previous years, it picks up obviously previous work you've submitted, so don't plagiarise your own work.
Yeah. It's got to be new work. It's very important, and this is one I've had personal experience of that, where somebody's basically adapted a piece of work that they would have done the year before on a similar subject, and actually thought in good faith, they actually thought that was okay because it was like their work and they were just using some of it in a similar, for, part of it in the thing, but it was actually, it involved, appointments and difficult conversations and referrals up to the dean and all that horrible stuff kind of happened. So, yes. Not an urban myth. You can't reuse your own stuff. Sorry. It'd be great if you could, wouldn't it? No, you can't. That's definitely comes under the remit of plagiarism. Any other questions about plagiarism?
What if you cite your previous work, so there's no issue there?
Citing your previous work. The thing about it's usually going to come under personal comms, because the thing about references is they should be somewhere that's actually accessible. If your previous work is something that's just accessible through sitting in the system or whatever, if it's not been published in a journal or in a newspaper or whatever, it's actually not, it's actually not a kind of referenceable material. So it's just one thing to look at. Arguably, you can say it comes under I think, remember for API, I think it's personal communication, whatever. But again, it's don't want to be seeing 3 or 4 of those in an essay.
If you published an article, say on LinkedIn, which is public domain, can you reference that? Because it's technically not personal comms, it's now out in the free domain.
Yeah, it's the same as like if you had a blog, if you had I reckon, it's published. And, there's, LinkedIn's a very useful platform to do that, I find. Yeah, good. All right. Any questions? Other questions about academic integrity? Get out of the way. Anything else comes up, bring it up with your tutors. Better to ask than, it all to go wrong. All right. How are we doing for time? I'm trying to do things. Oh, good. I'm running on time. Course content. So in the LMS, you will see the subject guide under subject outline. You'll see actually, if you go in and look at it now, you'll see it actually says 31st of July release.pdf, because I've updated it today. But I haven't changed anything significant, so if you had a good look at it in the last couple of weeks, don't worry. What I've done is I've just updated all the tutorials to kind of reflect all the tutorials we're running. And what else did I do? Added in a guest speaker, I think, and I think I might have added in something for today. But otherwise, I know coordinators say we reserve the right to kind of change things throughout this kind of subject. I'm not going to. I'm not going to change the assignments, right? So if you want to get started on them now, you can. I'm not going to change it. I've put a basic kind of criteria for assessing assignments down there, but what we'll be providing to you in advance in the next few weeks is actually in both assignments is the actual full marking matrix. Because once again, criteria is good, but it's good to have the whole matrix. You really have a sense of kind of how, the different points at which you're trying to hit your mark when you're trying to get those really high marks. And once again, that's the approach I kind of like to kind of take is to actually be as transparent and clear as possible about what the, on what basis you will be marked. Just in case not everybody's doing it. So we're still using our own LMS. We're not using, there's no funny trials or anything happening with this subject. There's no keyboard key loggers or nothing weird like that's happening, which is great. Also, what else? I mean, so your tutors will be marking your papers. My role as the course coordinator is in moderation of the papers and to kind of coordinate and to clarify with the tutors across whether there's questions about whether an assignment should be more, whether certain parts of an assignment need to be X, Y, or Z to be a H1 as against a H2A, that kind of thing. So but your tutors are the ones who are actually, take responsibility for kind of bringing you on the journey with the assignments. And I'm not going to have any external markers or just random people looking at them. I mean, they might swap over papers and kind of check different ones or whatever, just to kind of see, just to try to get that consistency. And that's it. And also, it's been the policy of the university for quite a number of years that there's no bell curving. I don't think the word's still got out to everybody in terms of that, but basically there is the marks you get will be merit marks. I don't believe in any way kind of adjusting them for some kind of average, because there should be an average. If the average of this subject is goes up to 72, it means you're all brilliant and we've done a good job, right? Probably won't be. Probably be about 69 as it usually is, but we'll see. All right. Just quickly to run through. So, today we're. I've outlined, in terms of the intended learning outcomes, they're very kind of broad at this point, but I did want to kind of, with them, give you a sense of kind of how we're kind of navigating through what I'll keep talking about, which is kind of the housing system throughout the 12 weeks. From next week, we start to get into the kind of really deep dive into some of the real details around kind of housing research and housing theory, and really try to work with a kind of get you into a really good understanding of the language and the kind of the geography, so to speak, of housing. Including the third week, we're Terry Burke's going to be joining us. Terry's an eminent scholar of 40 years or more in housing studies. He's based at Swinburne. He is you'll see some of his readings on the reading list. He is a very kind of significant kind of thinker kind of in the space, and he's very good on certain things, especially some of the economic stuff, which I'm all right. I did a big economics in undergrad, but it's not my strength, to be honest. So I'm kind of asked him to come in to help out a bit with that, just to really kind of deliver it well on week 3. But he'll probably talk about a whole lot of other things as well, because he's got so much knowledge. He wanted to do about 3 guest lectures, but he's going away in a couple of weeks, so he couldn't. But glad to have him for 1 week. Week 4, I want to kind of, once we've kind of looked at the basic structure of things, I want to start bringing in some of the big ideas and the big trends kind of that are happening kind of in housing, and a bit of a global perspective, and try to get our kind of heads around financialization, which some of you may be familiar with, some of you won't be. But it's a very important concept to understand in the context of housing. It's probably an important subject to understand in the context of everything, really, in terms of kind of the impact on the movement of kind of capital across the world, the implications of that. But it's had very significant implications for housing. So, so there's really at that point we're kind of trying to bring in kind of a broader kind of perspective of what's happening with housing as against a kind of this a narrow view of supply and demand, mortgage, interest rates, cost of bricks, etc. Get a little bit more interesting than that. Of course, the cost of bricks is very important. I'm not going to undermine that for any of you who do construction. Weeks 5 to 8. Okay, week 5, again, it's not very exciting. Hopefully I'll make it intelligible, not too boring, but we do really have to kind of, you know, really want to lay out what the system is and what those system things are in terms of kind of taxation, in terms of subsidies and incentives, those levers that happen, especially the state levers that happen and their influence on housing. Week 6. Now, we'll be talking about kind of planning in the meantime. Just because we're focusing on planning week 6 doesn't mean that planning is not going to come up a lot, probably, in the intervening period. But week 6, we start to kind of look at then that's what the role of planning is. Now, I should say at this point as well, I was probably going to say at the start, but it's reminded me, this is an Australian housing subject, right? I'm focusing on Australia, and a lot of the time focusing on Victoria and even Melbourne. And the reason we're doing that is partly because that's the expectation of the kind of faculty in terms of kind of how things are focused, but also that's what actually, that's going to help us keep things kind of manageable in terms of complexity, to be quite honest. Yeah, there are similarities with the Australian kind of housing systems with other parts of the world, and there are major differences as well. We will try to kind of, as we kind of go through, kind of reflect those and reflect on the lessons of those, of the differences, etc. But we are here focused on the Australian system, and when I talk about planning, probably focusing on the Victorian system. And part of the reason we're focusing on the Victorian system is, I don't know how much you guys have got into this, but I find it remarkable, especially with stuff that affects housing. The differences between the states and Australia is huge. Every state and territory has got really significant variances in terms of planning levers, planning policies as they relate to housing. And really that's a subject, I could do 12 weeks on that. I don't think I would want to, it's get a bit much, but you know, so we're focusing on Victoria because there's been a bit happening the last couple of years, so there's a bit to look at, and there's been a bit of change, there's been a bit of hope. There's still a bit of hope, you know, so there's plenty to kind of look at in that space. And we're also trying to pick it apart in terms of how the levers are kind of different in terms of statutory and kind of strategic planning. There's overlaps, but there's also some significant kind of differences in how much strategic might look at kind of land and kind of land value in terms of uplift for rezoning, as against statutory is looking at specific kind of dealing with developers and looking at stuff where the kind of, I guess, the realisable land values already be worked out, that kind of stuff. Week 7, construction and design. There's so much to talk about there. I'm bringing in Alexa Gower, who's really good, does some really good work looking at apartment buildings in different parts of the world, including Melbourne, and looking at the intersection of concepts of good design and kind of planning, and then the economic implications of that in terms of apartment building. There's a lot to talk about in the kind of the construction space. Obviously, it's very hot at the moment with the cladding issue, whatever. I'm probably not going to do a lot about cladding. Of course, it's on a lot of housing, but it's just a whole other thing that's kind of, you can kind of look at elsewhere, even though there's a kind of current issue. But there's plenty to talk about in terms of we were looking at management, the concept of management in terms of housing systems, the impact of this really kind of perverse kind of systems where we have state planning and we have this national construction code and we have all these gaps in between. So that's coming out a lot in the cladding kind of issues that we're learning about, but it actually has implications all over in terms of actually the quality of the buildings that we have. Week 8, climate change. Kosher Colston used to do She's now at Climate Works out in Monash, who are a fantastic kind of unit who do kind of really focus on communicating kind of the impacts of climate change. But she's got a really strong background, again, in kind of building and looking at the impacts of climate change. I'll do it before kind of bring Kulja in. I'll talk a lot, I'll look at the health frame in terms of housing. It is a space that's, I think, becoming more to the fore these days, and I think climate change or the climate emergency that we're in is kind of, and the recognition of things like the urban heat island effect is making that kind of more kind of clear. But the fact of the matter is that we've had, you know, the quality of housing we have in Australia, especially quality of housing for people on low incomes and kind of health impacts have been really, you know, are a really significant factor and are really important consideration for things like state housing. Paul mentioned kind of the, you know, the 64,000 units kind of houses and apartments and building units that are owned by the state that provide on the public housing system. Now, 60% of them are over 30 years old, and you know, and some of them are a lot more than 30 years old. Some are currently being knocked down, which is good, mostly. You know, these kind of things actually kind of really matter as well in terms of, well, what is the future setting in terms of the challenge to have to house people and to especially house people who are kind of housed out of the private market, but also the costs involved in actually building healthy housing. So I want to kind of touch on that a bit. Then on week 9, I'm going to focus on homelessness, because I don't think we can talk about housing without talking about homelessness. Now, a lot of people love to talk about housing and never want to talk about homelessness. And that's why I'm deliberately wanting to talk about homelessness, because it is actually part of the housing system. Structurally, within how government policy and a lot of even kind of the media representation, et cetera, it tends to be separated out. Discussion of housing, you know, people never make a relationship between the kind of cost of the cost of house prices and the fact that you may be seeing more people kind of actually sleeping on the street. But there is a relationship between that, and it should be a pretty interesting session. There's and I'm going to kind of bring in some couple of people. Kelly Whitworth, who I'm currently working with on a research project about the Bendigo Street occupation. She's going to come in. She was one of the key activists in that occupation 2 years ago. That was an 8-month action, which is mentioned by Libby Porter in the reading this week. Libby obviously wasn't there, but anyway, she talks about it kind of theoretically. So Kelly's going to be coming in and talking, looking at kind of those kind of direct action kind of taken by people who are homelessness in relation to their situation. And I'll see who else. I haven't quite tied down who else, but there will be another person with direct lived experience kind of coming in, because that's very important. Since the homelessness crisis has been a big kind of issue in Melbourne, probably since about 2015, there's been a lot of kind of public discussions about it. They hardly ever involve the people directly affected by or have been directly affected by it actually speaking about their experience, and that's something that, you know, I think we need to kind of address. Week 10 should be a good one. This isn't the first time we'll talk about social and affordable housing throughout the subject, but on week 10 we're really going to focus in on it, and we're going to focus in on models and looking at the models that are kind of there, and you know, the existing models and future models, how they're working. Lincoln Thompson's been doing a lot of research in terms of future models. Hala from Housing First, which used to be called Port Phillip Housing Association, is a kind of, you know, 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 a kind of, you really a very kind of significant figure. It's great that she's got time to come in terms of actually one of the major kind of providers of community housing in Victoria in the last number of years, and has got significant experience right at the coalface of actually building new housing and new affordable housing. And you know, there's not a lot of people at the coalface of building new affordable housing in Melbourne the last 10 years because there hasn't been much of it built. But you know, so it's great to have her in and kind of have her perspective on how that's been going. Week 11, Bridget Salmon. Bridget's currently finishing a master's at the University in Rotterdam. She's a Monash scholar. I don't know if you know about the Monash scholarships. They're a really great thing if you can get them. You get a whole chunk of money. You can go somewhere in the world and do like study whatever you want, basically. And Bridget, because she is a brilliant planner, has managed to get that. And she's been researching housing models across Europe, but she's just going to be back a couple of weeks in Australia in October. So it'd be great to hear from her about what she's learned. And I know that she's been, you know, learning intently kind of about kind of what's happening across the world. And finally, I will probably have a guest speaker, but in terms of technology, the technology kind of future, I want to kind of probably look at two things in the final week. One is technology in terms of actually managing markets, or you know, the actual future of the impact of technology. Everybody can say, oh, you mean Airbnb? Actually, not just Airbnb. I mean, there's actually you know, potentially a lot of emerging markets that can be aided by technology in terms of kind of matching people who may want to purchase or rent in the disability sector or whatever. So I want to look at that because I think it's important to kind of understand where that might be going and what the innovation and the benefits that might bring, or also the risks that might bring as well. And we also want to kind of look at as well, look at the actual, what's happening with the homes in terms of the actual built form of the homes as well, and whether is that changing, does that matter? You know, you hear smart home all the time, you can get, you know, light bulbs now that you can, you know, move, you know, change with your app or whatever, but, you know, but the types of housing that we've had and the way housing has worked hasn't really changed very much in kind of a significant amount of time. And so we'll be kind of asking that question, well, are there significant changes happening, whether they're through materials, whether they're through provision, whether they're through actual the topology in terms of scale or form, etc. So I hope you'll stay with me till week 12, so you know, you'll find that interesting at the end. I know it's hard because, you know, it's the end of the semester and you tend to have lots of things to kind of do, whatever, but it'd be great if you can kind of stay the course in terms of the lectures. This is assignment 1. How are we on time? 6:13. All right, I'm going to zip through this. This is assignment 1. It is your tutors will be talking to you about this one to kind of help you through it, because it's a little bit different. I'm asking you to kind of bring yourself a lot to an academic paper. Bring yourself and your family's experience, but then map it onto the housing systems, an experience of housing systems. So it's not easy. It's not just, I grew up here and I lived there and then I rented a place here, rented that. Nah, it's not. It's a lot more than that. But from my experience when teaching this subject, where I've changed it a little bit, but we had a similar assignment 2 years ago. It ended up being a very kind of powerful and very, I think, very useful thing for the student group to kind of go through in terms of then kind of engaging to the rest of the semester. So see how you go. It's not straightforward, but hopefully you might actually enjoy kind of writing it, if you can enjoy writing any assignment. Hi.
Is the personal narrative that we should be using in this assignment similar to Urban Country and Urban Country? The way that
I think in terms of, that's not a bad style, you know, that's not a bad style. You have options of how much you place your stuff, whether you make it an I or not, but you know, so it doesn't have to be first person. Sometimes that can be very challenging, but in terms of that actually bringing yourself to it, then
Are you
sir,
okay with the first person?
absolutely okay with the first person. But you don't. It doesn't have to be first person, because I know sometimes people have different barriers to that. Sometimes cultural, sometimes just in terms of feeling kind of confident to use the first person. So, you know, you could write it in the third person as well. There's a way to do that. Yeah. And the second assignment research paper is pretty much, you got lots of options there. And what I'm kind of asking you to do is, now that you kind of, you know, by the time you're writing this paper, you've done the course and you kind of know a lot about housing, tell us where things are going to be with a specific frame. And you might cross a number of these kind of frames, so you know, you might cross climate change with building quality or whatever, but I want you to have a primary kind of focus. But tell us, you know, well, where are things going by 2025? Where are things going in the short term? Because for you as kind of professionals and emerging professionals, I don't know where you all are in terms of your work history or what you can be doing, you're going to be influencing and maybe, you know, what happens in 2025 in the next couple of years. It's 2019 now, so I want you to kind of really apply the knowledge onto this subject in terms of, you know, what, you know, how you think things are going to be working. Right. Short break. If we can be back in 10 minutes, and then I'll do the kind of show you pictures, talk about some content, do a little mini lecture thing, and that'll be the end of week 1. But if we can be back at 6:27, please. Or you don't have to leave, but, you know, you check your phones and do whatever.
When I read your work, there's so much more to say.
Hi, Sylvia. Did you send me, when did you send me an email? Was it today?
No, it was earlier this week on the equity access. I did want to hand up but access me that didn't help. Obviously, I'll be writing a personal narrative.
Cool. And thank you for your questions. I've got
It's a tough crowd. I've done a few keynotes at universities, and it's just a blank wall. I'm like, wow, this is how the Russians felt facing the Germans. Wow. With the tutorials, I don't want to do anything on this with any admin. I'm just asking. I'm happy to sit on the phone. Can I attend one tutorial?
Oh! I've never been asked that before, Sylvia.
The reason I'm asking is
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I actually work in the public sector for justice and community safety. Procurement's had a lot of provisions like houses for prisons and things like that. But
Oh, good luck with that one. Yeah.
I had a rant at the GM and he just looked at me and he's like, you're smart with your mouth. And I'm like, yeah, well.
Oh boy. Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, so I previously did my thesis on something.
Actually, let's move away a bit from that. Thanks, Sylvia. I'm sorry I still haven't done it, but I am going to send out the suggestion, and I'll try to do it probably after. I'll send out a flat two kind of questions. No, I haven't got a head of this. Just as kind of, to help. Just okay. Are we at 6:27? 6:26. All right, we'll get back into it. So I'm just briefly going to do kind of a little three-part kind of run through some with a lot of pictures and some diagrams. This is more about just almost like kind of giving you some stuff to kind of, hopefully that will trigger enthusiasm and interest for the next 12 weeks. I'm especially conscious of the fact that for next week, for a few weeks, it's kind of, it's quite serious, and some of the papers aren't that easy to read and turgid, whatever. It's very important that you get them down, but I didn't want to overdo that in the first week. What do we see here? This is a 1860 or so image, and it's I think it would be fair to say a pretty kind of typical image of the kind of first kind of 100 years of kind of white settlement kind of Australia, in terms of the outback, the bush, as it relates to Aboriginal people. They have no clothes, they look fierce. They're usually not quite kind of actually drawn as in normal human form. And, oh look, they're threatening a couple of just innocent kind of white folk traveling along their horses. The reason I put that up there is we don't know where these guys live. And we hardly ever see where these guys live, what they do. It's like there's this, and this is what you see in the to an extent in Libby Porter's reading, but in the Pascoe reading this week, in Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, which I recommend if you haven't read it yet, read the whole book. And read other things that Bruce has written, and then the whole of it. And read the stuff he refers to, because it's all great. But what Bruce is saying is that there's been a lie. There's been this kind of lie in Australia, and this denial of how Australia was, how this big continent was before 230 years ago. And I'll just kind of read this out here. I can't kind of do justice to his wonderful dulcet tones. Explorers saw fields of yam extending to the horizon in Western Australia, fields of murnong occupying the whole plains between Adelaide and Melbourne, terraces of the hillsides created by the production and harvest of the same vegetable, cereal crops harvested and bundled into sheaves prior to threshing, fishing systems of such ingenuity they couldn't understand how they worked, villages of thousands of people of such beauty and peace that they were envious. I was like, villages of thousands of people? This has been hardly told. This is only kind of coming to light that there is a tens and tens of thousands of years of history of housing in Australia, and it's very important that I think we kind of acknowledge this, that we don't start with the housing discussion with the first shacks that were put up in what is now Sydney after the the first fleet arrived, etc., which tends to be the kind of the narrative, and how Sydney developed different from Melbourne and la 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 la. We need to kind of go back a bit. So kind of here you see some very complex construction, and the construction across Australia used many different types of materials. They're all local materials, but they're including, even though not much of it kind of survives, but including significant amount of stone materials in some areas, including in Western Victoria. But most often wood, different reeds, different bark, etc. was kind of used. But what we have here is a significant history of actually housing forms that actually work with the land, with the space, and with the community. I mean, what's housing about? Housing's about, well, it's a place for people to live, but it's a place for kind of family formation and connection. But it's also usually a place it has a relationship to industry or tasks or whatever, whether it be agriculture or fishing or going into the city to kind of, work in a policy job or whatever. And all these things existed for tens of thousands of years in Australia. Black history in Australia is the old, this is the oldest living culture on this earth. And but only now, in recent years, especially probably with Bruce Pascoe's work a few years ago, Dark Emu, that people really rethinking how this country kind of was. So that's using bark. That's in Western Victoria. This is in Western Australia, I think, in the 1880s. And then we get to this. This is in a place outside Melbourne called Corranderk. And this is where we're going to get to the local story and kind of connect in with the Libby Porter's reading this week, talking about urban country. Now, Corranderk is a little, it's just a few k's, or a couple of k's outside Lilydale, which is out, I don't know where Lilydale is. He's heard of it. It's a train line. Out on the edge, the north eastern edge of Melbourne. Within, I think, about 25 years of kind of white settlements and the establishment of Melbourne, there were only identifiable 29 people of the Kulin Nation in the area. That's all that was left. And to protect them, they were put in this essentially a reservation, you might understand it in terms of kind of popular kind of culture, like, you know, what was done to Native Americans. Essentially, they were put in a reservation. But a funny thing happened with Corandurk, which seemingly wasn't meant to happen. It was an incredibly successful community. And it was an incredibly successful and productive agricultural community. And that was a real surprise to the settler colonialists in Melbourne at the time, because they completely did not recognise, as many people today do not recognise, that Aboriginal people had an incredible kind of knowledge of their land and knowledge of agriculture. That success was actually the end of the kind of independence of that of Corandurk, and while it lasted as a place up to 1924, it's the systems of government kind of started to put down on it. They started stealing the children, etc. All that horror that we know about, if we want to know about, in terms of the history of this country. They grew good hops. And just a note, and just kind of what Libby Porter says here, the categories in which urban Australia is understood, the time frames marking eras and shifts, the theoretical frames for explaining urban processes are all fundamentally silent on the underlying endurance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignties. What Libby Porter's doing in her paper is she's to an extent looking back and saying we actually have a duty to stop with this forgetting, and we need to be doing remembering and recognising. But also what she's saying is, what is that actually, you know, there's actually something in this for all of us here if we kind of acknowledge that we're on country and we open ourselves up to what that means and what we can learn from that. You might be familiar with this. Does anybody know whose face this is on the portrait building? It's William Barrack, yes. William Barrack was Wurundjeri elder. He ended up living in Corandurk and was kind of a leader of people in Corandurk. He was also a fantastic artist. There's some of his work in the NGV in Fed Square. If you want to go in there and see any of it, this is just amazing. But this is a building designed by ARM Architects. I think it was finished about 6 years ago. Called the Portrait Building, and it's regarded by some as a powerful acknowledgement of the original kind of people of this kind of land, and that they're still here. But by others as a disgraceful piece of tokenism, which is not, is not actually intelligible unless you really want to know. And I think it's important that if you go into the basement of that building and kind of wander around, you'll find out a lot about the brewery that used to be there. You won't find out anything about William Barrack. to me, it kind of shows kind of a little bit about kind of where things are at in terms of kind of us living on country. I just thought on this kind of segment I'd kind of leave you with this. This is a young Melbourne artist called Aretha Brown, who's and this is a piece of work that I kind of discovered in the NGV at an exhibition of young artists from the western suburbs. And it kind of shows, to take things out of these kind of pixelated kind of black and white images of kind of people in huts, it kind of brings us into kind of what is the kind of city right now, with the metro train and the kind of the coolness and the kind of energy and the high rises, and this is kind of I think an example of the energy that's actually happening across planning, across in policy spaces and in cultural spaces that's happening, that does actually begin to have an impact on kind of housing as well at the moment, in terms of Aboriginal people, young Aboriginal people are actually kind of taking the space and taking their identity and kind of I guess challenging the kind of norms. So I thought I'd leave you with that. So to move on from that briefly, over time, good. You'll see as we go through the readings and that there's references to a lot of different kind of historical kind of trends that have happened in kind of Australian housing. I don't want to go too much into that in this course. I mean, if you want to do housing history, you can do subjects in housing history. I think history is important, but it can end up being, just interesting. And I love history, obviously. But I thought I'd just kind of touch on, because of the first assignment that we're doing, just touch on the idea of actually looking at kind of the history of housing through kind of narratives that exist. Narratives that might exist through images, and narratives that exist in books, and not necessarily in historical texts, but sometimes in biography, in fiction, in kind of philosophical kind of writing, or in kind of some, as I'll show you, some current research that's being done. Robert Menzies. I know not all of you are from Australia, and I'm not originally, but I learned about Robert Menzies. A pretty important kind of figurehead in Australia in the mid-20th century. He was the guy who coined the kind of phrases that we want to be lifters, not leaners, in 1953. It came back into common usage. I think, which Prime Minister was it now? Keep up, Turnbull, I think, or maybe it was Abbott more recently. But he was a Liberal Prime Minister, and he really encapsulated in a series of, he'd been Prime Minister and he ended up on the backbench and kind of, looked like he was kind of, his career was over, but he did a series of lectures on the radio. And everybody got really excited about it because he really kind of captured this idea of kind of what some people thought Australia should be or could be in the post-war era. That's a kind of key phrase: a home's material, home's human, home's spiritual. It's a lovely idea, and I found this image, which is from 1966. And in 1966, 70% of Australians own their own home. That was the peak home ownership. It's been dropping since then, and starting to drop significantly in recent years. But basically, from that kind of early 50s, Menzies putting this idea of home ownership as the ideal, incredible amount of kind of home ownership did happen into the 60s and right through into the 70s to the 80s as well. And I thought this really kind of captures this kind of dominant kind of idea of Australia. And to go with that, I thought I'd read you an extract from, you might have heard of this. It's a book, again, written about the same period by Donald Horne called The Lucky Country, which is a kind of a part cynical, part celebratory kind of book about what is Australia. But I thought I like this bit and I'll read it out. I won't do an Aussie accent, no, sorry. It's hard to imagine how one can understand Australia unless one approaches sympathetically the life most Australians lead and the values they follow. For instance, Australia is an extraordinarily stable society. The self-satisfaction that is so often attacked is one expression of this stability. Australians seem to know what they want, and it includes a house with an average of 5 to 6 rooms, set in its own garden, a considerable amount of privacy, domestic comfort, and involvement in family life. There is a strong materialist streak in Australians. They like things that are useful to them in their homes, and they will work overtime to buy them on hire purchase. Everybody know what hire purchase is now? It's like, buy it on tick. Yeah. People put it on credit cards these days. They have a strong philosophy on how life should be led. You save money and get married, you pay a deposit on the house and furnish it, you hope your children will lead a happier life than you have led, you plan your retirement so you will enjoy it, and when you die you will leave your house to your children so that it can be sold and the money used to help pay off the mortgages on their own houses. Lovely. And that's it. That's Australia, right? That's kind of, the way, the idea. At least it was the idea. But it still isn't a very dominant kind of idea culturally about what housing kind of means in Australia. And you can see that within that, housing is obviously you get a house and it provides all this benefit, all these goods. But it also provides, it's an investment. It provides this great thing. You can leave it to your kids to pay off this mortgage. So the idea of the housing as a commodity is already firmly kind of entrenched in the idea of kind of home purchase 50 years ago. But there's another experience, and I thought I'd kind of take it back to other narratives that have always been happening in Australia. There's a tendency to think like 50 years ago, 60 years ago, everybody was having a good time, it was all really good, there was full employment, this, that, and the other. Australia's always had significant numbers of people who have had poor housing, unaffordable housing, or haven't been able to house themselves. That's not a new thing. It's always been there. It was particularly prevalent in the 1940s, in the post-war period, and we'll be kind of coming back to that. It's an important period in terms of kind of housing policy and what happened there, and development of public housing. Zelda Sopranos, to my mind, a very significant figure in terms of Melbourne kind of social history and political history. This is a very kind of famous photo of her. I don't know if you know, opposite kind of Target and Burke Street, there's an old kind of deco building that used to be a bank. It's now being taken over by Melbourne City Council as their offices. It's got a kind of lovely kind of entrance. But if you look at it, that's her chain to the doors of what was then the Commonwealth Bank. And she did this to kind of protest against what was unequal pay, differential rates for men and women in terms of doing the same job, which apparently was an acceptable thing in the 60s and right through into the 70s until the Equal Pay Act, which I think was 1974. Might be wrong, 75. But Zelda story, and then kind of in her biography, kind of talks about kind of her early life. She'd basically herself and her husband, who was a returned kind of service man from World War II, spent years basically living on couches, living in kind of beg, stealing, borrowing from family and friends in overcrowded dwellings in inner Melbourne. Years after the war, they'd be defined under the modern definition of homelessness in terms of actually not having a secure place to live. And she talks about basically hassling. They were beginning to, gets into the early 50s, they were beginning to start to build this big building program of public housing under the Housing Commission into the late 40s, into the early 50s. And what you see there, she talks about continually ringing the Housing Commission to obtain a house. Return service people, like her husband, were meant to get ahead on this, but it wasn't happening. But, you know, she was told, or she heard, oh, well, it's actually, you've got to wait and turn. There's a long queue. So that's kind of very familiar. That hasn't changed very much. But as luck would have it, and she describes in her book as being very awkward and difficult and assertive with the bureaucrats to kind of try to get what she wants. She did end up getting what's called a maisonette in Heidelberg West, which is was one of the big sites of public housing built at the time. It still is a big site of public housing, a site of kind of major redevelopment actually in recent years. This isn't her, I found this photo, but this is where she would have kind of lived. But it's interesting what she describes. She talks about, at that time, there's a big talk about the Australian car was coming. The Australian car, the Holden car, and when the Australian car comes, that's going to kind of change everything. And then they found out how much it costs, how many £100, and they thought, no, we're never going to be able to afford that Australian car. And what they found, and what her husband found from moving out to Heidelberg, which is these days would be kind of seen as inner ring, but at that time it was kind of like the edge of the city. What they found was that the actual getting to his job was actually really expensive because of public transport, and he couldn't afford a car. They weren't benefiting from this promise and what happened with Melbourne, with the radial city and the kind of everything based on the freeways or whatever. They still had to pay for the buses and the trains, etc. So I just kind of thought that kind of story is there's a consistent thread of that in terms of those benefiting from a kind of dominant kind of idea of what Australia can deliver in terms of housing, and those who don't. And I'll just kind of briefly mention then a modern example of this. This is some work that I was involved in my job at Moreland Council, where we did a piece of research, mostly kind of data research, but we also brought in some qualitative research to try to get a picture of, in the municipality I work in, who lives here, what's the story, and what's the future of it, because we need to try to kind of do something about, especially in terms of it with an equity lens on who can afford to live here or who can afford to live here in the future. And so it's called A Home in Moreland. You can Google it and download it. It's actually a really good piece of work. I'm quite happy with it. But here's the kind of modern kind of two sides of the story kind of thing happening in Melbourne. Irfan is, he works in tech. Came over here as a skilled migrant, I think about in the early 2000s from Pakistan. Before he got married, he lived in share houses, and probably overcrowded share houses around Brunswick for about 5 or 6 years. Then he got married. He'd saved up, managed to get just before, I don't know if you know Faulkner. Like Faulkner was cheap 10 years ago, not anymore, right? So he managed to just get in before it became kind of unaffordable even to him on a very good wage. And then he's got 2 kids, he's got a house, got a backyard, he's 14 k's from the city centre. That's pretty good these days. So that experience, that common experience of, in a way, he's like those, Menzies would be happy with his kind of experience there. He managed to get that, and he's very happy about it. Irfan was involved with me in council in looking at affordable housing, and he was kind of going, he was kind of making arguments to me that maybe, there's, we shouldn't be focusing on rental, we should be focusing on purchase. It's great to own a place. And I'm like, okay, fair enough, okay. And then the other side, you have Helen. Helen, if you're involved and you go out to I talked earlier about kind of peer advocates. Helen's very active as a peer advocate for kind of people who are homeless, and Helen also lives with a mental health disability as well, and talks about that. But her experience is she didn't realize she was homeless. In fact, she just didn't have any proper place to live for years. She didn't know where she was going to live from month to month. And it wasn't until she actually got a place, got a small one-bedroom flat, newly built flat in Coburg, that she kind of reflected on the fact that she now had stable housing. And she's kind of taken that and run with it and said, well, now I've got stability, I want to kind of talk about this. And, she's fantastic. She's kind of very real. But her experience as an older woman in Melbourne is getting increasingly common, and that's something that comes up again and again, that for a whole lot of reasons, a whole lot of kind of basic kind of structural reasons around kind of how things are structured, how our central kind of patriarchal kind of structure, and how that reflects into how much money, wealth, power kind of women have, job opportunities. Many women are actually becoming homeless or at very high risk of homelessness in later life. When years ago it was only older men that got at risk of homelessness. So that kind of brings us up to, when did we do those interviews? Early last year. So it's kind of modern. I'm running on time. 5 more minutes and we'll leave, and I'm going to try to do this every week, that I don't run up to the full 2 hours. That's not fair. You should have 10 minutes at the end, so I'm going to try to do that. What I want to do is, one of your readings for next week is by Terry Burke and Kath Holtz. He said it talks about it's a 2010 paper. You think, oh, well, that's going to be out of date. No, it isn't. He talks about the GFC and stuff like that, and the housing crash that happened there. It's really, really relevant. But what I wanted to kind of draw your attention to is it contains within that paper some of the kind of key framing that I want you to kind of be thinking about in terms of how we navigate through this subject. Housing systems are complex. The Burke and Holtz paper for next week refers a lot to, talks about Michael Ball's work in the 80s. This is Michael Ball trying to get a handle on, graphically represent the complexity of housing systems. And he did a lot of work. His work in the 80s is really important and still relevant in terms of actually really trying to grasp what are we trying to know and understand when we kind of look at kind of housing. Where should we be looking and how do they interact? And it's incredibly complex. So this is one of the things that kind of brought us kind of along the way. But what Terry and Kath, Burke and Holtz do in that paper and kind of since then is they try to synthesize kind of some of this work that kind of Ball and others have done kind of way back into a more kind of simple model, but a model that gives us an opportunity to kind of pull apart the different parts of the kind of system and then look at how they interact. So this is something that's, so we'll be coming back to this, but I just want to introduce it to you to kind of, as a kind of key kind of framing for the subject in terms of a housing system and how you kind of look at a housing system. So under this kind of idea, production is not just building, but it's land assembly, land development, land sales. So it's that part of the system. Consumption is obviously all that's involved. It's about the market for selling housing, but it's also a market for renting housing as well. So it's about the market, what people do, how people do to get housing, and what's involved with that. Exchange is looking at the systems, then the process systems that actually enable kind of housing to happen. That's where we get into look at financial systems and banks. We also look at real estate systems as well. So those mechanics, the mechanics of actually how housing happens or not, or how housing gets to market, who it gets to market to, etc. And then finally, management. Don't you love that word management? It's kind of like you hear the word management these days, you just go, oh. It's just like, it's such a kind of, I don't know. For me anyway, I hear management and kind of go, oh yeah, management, usually crap. You know, but management in this system, in this kind of theory, is essentially what the state does. And the state, in Australia, when we're talking about the state, we're talking about 3 levels of government. We're talking about the federal, state, and kind of local government. So we're talking about the policy, the planning rules, the levers, the fiscal policy, all those things that actually, and you know, things that underpin, let's say, you know, financial management. For instance, we've seen some effects out of the Royal Commission to banking has had an effect on housing recent times. And that's a kind of function of management in a way. It's a function of, they set up a Royal Commission because they really wanted to, not really, but they did. And then there was an effect of that in terms of the narrative that's emerged out of that and the basically the undeniable kind of truths that emerged out of the Royal Commission about essentially the deeply kind of corrupt and abusive practices the banks often kind of do in relation to money and also the risks involved in that in terms of kind of potentially in terms of the risks on individuals in terms of, you know, giving people money that they can't afford to pay back, etc. So that's had an effect on markets. You know, there's you know, I've had this experience recently because I recently purchased a property where I got from the person who was organising the mortgage basically a list of suburbs where they just wouldn't put any money into for certain types of houses. Like literally whole parts of the city said no. So I guess when we're talking about management, we're talking about that the state really matters. You might think housing is a, you know, within a capitalist system, housing is very much kind of, it's market driven, this, that and the other. We're going to be talking a lot about where the state is and how it's important in housing systems all across these other 3 kind of sections throughout that. So I just wanted to introduce it to you now so you kind of think, oh, okay, start thinking about that. And it might be helpful in your first assignment as well as a way to frame things. Okay. You had a question?
So that list of suburbs where banks won't put money in,
Yeah.
aside from it being a management of risk and really showing just how much we all are a number on their ledger,
Yeah.
is there a reason for particular suburbs? Like, was there any additional context provided?
Well, part of it's about, there isn't context provided when you get information like that, but you can infer into it that it's a read on risk. So basically it's a read on risk in terms of, we'll touch on it in a bit. For instance, the kind of looking at what's happening with houses on land, the value rise versus apartments in the last 10 years. It's been very interesting. And then there's the effect on that. So banks will kind of go, for various reasons, we're getting a little bit squeamish about all these apartments. Maybe they're you know, maybe the market's just not that solid. Because at the end of the day, there's risks with them, and there's things like the cladding thing comes in. There's things like, you know, there are other costs involved, get people into trouble, get people overextended, costs of actually, you know, paying for the pool in the apartment, those kind of things. And they kind of say, we're going to stick with houses that are on bits of land. Because something that's attached to a bit of land gives us a lot lower risk at the moment. So, but again, people speculate. You could probably get 5 different reasons why banks do things. People have different speculation. It's not always rational. Talk a bit about that as well. 7:05. I'm done. Okay. Thanks all for coming in week 1. And look forward to seeing you back next week, where we're going to get stuck into a lot of detail. There'll be numbers and graphs and concepts and all of that. And I hope it all goes well with your first tutorials tomorrow. Thank you.
Very much, Mike.
Good.
I've sent you anyway. So I've sent you an email with an attachment to that, so you'll find it.
When did you send it?
Just after the seminar.
Alright, I haven't seen it yet. But it's just alright, I'll put a face to the name then, and I'll read that, and if I need to get back to you, I will, yeah? Okay. There's enough for a learning, you know, think about learning outcomes.
But we have to see.
Actually, I don't know finding it.
They need to visualize themselves because it can be very fun in a control, out of it. But then, yes, but that's the opportunity.
And it's about checking in, checking that. You know, okay, that's a good way, yeah. But it can be quite for the more students as well, because they can, they'll assume that they know the stuff.
Yeah.
You don't know this federal national state.
Oh no, I don't think they know. But that's cool. I don't think the first assignment will be interesting.
Yeah.
So I can just make notes of stuff. Great. So we're going in touch and we have this app for
We have this app, and I'll send through a message this evening just with the, wait, I'm going to shut this down so it stops recording. Stop recording.
Thanks, Mark.
Alright, thanks Marjan. See you soon.
Set that through to you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll look at that and, yeah, try to get sorted out as soon as possible.
I've put in like what a suggestion, like alternating between Marjan and Paul
Yeah.
or Alex. No, Paul's in 7:15. And then
Alex is 7:15.
sorry, alternate between Marjan and Paul, and then Alex is my main interviewer that I submitted into.
I'll try to have a look at it, check your emails in the morning, get your folks got to the bottom so we can Thank you.